Hi, everyone. It's Lisa from Been There, Got Out. And today's guest popped on for a brief moment yesterday. Her name is Andrea Nave, and she is called How to Beat Anxiety Blog. I think I had said How to Beat Your Anxiety, but it's How to Beat Anxiety Blog on Instagram. There she is. And let me get her on here. Rampant in our community of people getting out of toxic relationships, going through high conflict divorce, separations, custody battles, co-parenting hell, and then some. So thank you so much, Andrea. And it's good to see you back since yesterday. I'm glad the camera worked really well.
Yes, that's always a good thing. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So first of all, do you think that people are more anxious now than they have been in prior generations?
Yes, definitely. I think, specifically this year, a lot of people can probably relate to it's an election year. So election anxiety is definitely very high, as well as other issues that are going on in terms of the economy and gun violence. Those are a lot of things, right, that maybe people didn't have to deal with in generations before then. And I think, we're able to identify anxiety a lot more now than we were able to in the past. So people are talking about it more.
Yeah. Okay, so before we even start, can you officially introduce yourself? So I don't, 'cause I can't keep up with all the accolades, and you've had a wealth of experience.
Yeah, sure. So, yep, my name's Andrea Nave, and as you already said, I'm the creator of the How to Beat Anxiety blog. I am a licensed therapist. I am in private practice in Connecticut, but I'm also licensed in New York. I specialize in the treatment of anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, as well as parenting anxious youth.
Yeah. So what is anxiety?
Yeah, so it's interesting. People ask this question, and sometimes they think it's a stupid question to ask. Like, we should know what anxiety is, but a lot of people don't, right? You've probably
Yeah.
experienced it in your life, right? You know what it feels like, but people don't always talk about what exactly it is. So, when we think about anxiety, I think the best way to really describe it is thinking of the system that's in your body that's there to go off and alert you when it perceives that there's a threat or if there is a real threat. So a good way that I explain it to like kids that I work with is it's like it's our alarm system, right? It's there to keep us safe. And if it thinks or perceives again that something bad's going to happen, it's going to alert us, right? And it's going to go off. So its job again is really just to keep us safe. The problem with anxiety is that it doesn't always get it right. So it makes sense, right, that you would have some type of fear response if, let's say, you're going hiking and you come in contact with a bear, right? It makes sense that your nervous system would be activated because it's there to protect you, to say, hey, we need to either stay and fight, we need to run away, right? That's that fight or flight or freeze. Those are all ways to keep you alive. But again, what happens when it goes off at the wrong time, that's that false alarm. And it's not really a life or death situation. So it's going off at the wrong time.
Yeah, and that's the part that's so confusing. Like when someone has a panic attack out of nowhere. And I remember sometimes in the past I'd just be driving and I'd get this sense of dread and I had no idea why.
Right. Yeah. And that's the problem is that we're not always consciously aware of why something is going off, right? Sometimes it's very obvious. So, based on previous experiences that we've had, you've probably heard the idea in the trauma world of like the body keeps the score, right? Our nervous system remembers experiences that we've had. And from there, will try to alert us. So let's say that when you were in the second grade, you got up and you gave a presentation and it went really bad and everyone laughed at you. Now your nervous system is going to remember that and it's likely going to alert you every time you get up to give a presentation, right? It's trying to say, hey, this could not go well again. So even if you're not consciously aware of something, like, why is this happening, right? There's some reason that you're feeling anxious in that moment again, even if you're not consciously aware of it.
So are there ways to get rid of it if it's something from the past and you're not even consciously aware of it? How do you even know what to do about it?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of, so I'm more of a cognitive behavioral therapist, and a lot of what we do with that behavior piece is doing exposure therapy. So that's basically retraining your nervous system to be able to recognize, like, hey, you don't need to alert me anymore. So again, if I go back to that example of having a really bad public speaking experience in the second grade, and my nervous system keeps alerting me every time I go to give a speech, over time again, most people are going to try to avoid that, right? And then that ends up teaching the nervous system, hey, this must be dangerous because you never get up and give a speech, right? So through exposure therapy, we help people to be able to do those things again in a very gradual manner. So maybe you start with, hey, I'm going to, give a presentation in front of one or two people, and I'm going to work up to doing that with more people, because over time, the nervous system starts to learn, like, hey, nothing bad's happening. No one's laughing at us. We're okay. And it starts to learn, like, hey, we don't have to set that false alarm off anymore. Everything's okay. But again, people tend to avoid things because they don't want to feel comfortable. And that ends up maintaining that false alarm and that anxiety over time.
Yeah, so that brings me to this idea I was going to ask you about. What are some misconceptions about anxiety? And I'm thinking you just answered one, in that people think, well, I've got this fear and I can't ever get rid of it. It's just there. Like, this is just me.
Right. Yes. And that's a huge misconception. I know when I started my blog a few years ago, I was getting emails from people being like, wow, I have hope for the first time that I don't have to live life like this, right? People just kind of accept, like, this is life for me. And
Mhm.
as you can imagine, when you start avoiding things, your life becomes very, very small,
Yeah.
right? You're not doing things, and that can lead to depression, substance use issues. So a lot comes with that. And I think knowing that, like, hey, anxiety is treatable. You don't have to live a life where you feel stuck at home, or that you can't face your fears, or that you can't drive a car, or that you can't do the things that you want to do. So luckily we have really good treatment. And part of that too that I work with patients on is externalizing your anxiety, right? It's really hard if you identify as like, well, I'm just an anxious
Mhm.
person. People feel less likely that they can do anything about it, as opposed to like, hey, I'm a person and I have this thing. I have an anxiety disorder, or I struggle with anxiety, but it doesn't define who you are, right? From that mindset, people can say, okay, well, that's only like a part of me, so I can do something about it, right? I can make a change. And again, luckily, we have good treatment for that. The problem is that most people don't have the education around it. And obviously, there's issues within the system that people don't have access to treatment or can't afford treatment. But again, we do have good treatment out there.
Yeah. Wow. So any other misconceptions besides thinking, well, I'm just anxious and that's it. That's the rest of my life.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconceptions around worry is a huge thing. A lot of people feel like they have no control over their worries, or that worry serves some type of benefit for them. So, well, if I worry, that means that I care. And you can care and not have to worry about something. Or that worry actually is helpful because it prepares me for the worst, when in reality, we know that's not true. So it's really helping people to understand that, again, worry is not helpful. So when I'm working with someone that has more of like a generalized anxiety disorder, so those are people that worry excessively, they feel like their worry is out of control, they have a lot of physical symptoms that come with that. We talk about, what's your role in the worry, right? So in reality, we don't control what our brain comes up with. So if, my brain naturally gives me a worry, I can choose how I respond to that thought. And that's an important notion that a lot of people are not aware of, right? Because if I start engaging with that thought and I start spiraling, oh, what if this happens? What if that happens? Right? I played a role in that, which also means if I can play a role in worrying, then I can also pull back and not worry as much, and recognize that worry in general is not helpful. A lot of times if you read about worry, worry is kind of described as, there's like the toxic worry, and then there's productive worry. And I tend to just loop everything together and say, hey, worry is not helpful. It's when we take action. So like yesterday, right? If I'm worried that, oh, what if I can't log on to this, right? Then what did I do? I took action. I emailed you and said, hey, what's the instructions? How do I, log on to this? I've never done one of these before, right? And that in turn can make us feel better. And that's where people really have to look and say, is this something I have control over? And if the answer is yes, then what action can I take?
Mm.
And if it's something I don't have any control over, right? There's certain situations where there's going to be things that are completely out of your control. You have to ask yourself, is this really helpful for me to be thinking about? Because in reality, it's probably only making you anxious and not feel good about yourself, but you can't do anything about it. So we really have to train our brain to think about what it is that's helpful for us and what we want to think about or see that's helpful. So I think helping people realize, like, you play a role in worry. It's not just something that happens to you, and you can do something about it. So that gives hope to people in realizing that they can learn strategies to reduce
Yeah.
worry.
I mean, I think back to my 10 years in particular in the family court system, and constantly worrying, and we call it awfulizing or catastrophizing, and thinking like, well, what if the judge never believes me, or what if, they change their mind, or what if my ex ends up taking all these things from me or takes my kids away? And it's just this constant sense of fear, because I think it doesn't feel like there's any control
Exactly.
over any of it. It's like I'm in this, so now it's not with another person, it's not with my own life, it's being in a system that's making these really significant decisions for myself and my family. And that's terrifying. And I just remember people saying, oh, just don't let that take up valuable real estate in your head. I'm like, I don't know what else to do about it. I mean, I like, often I'd be in court, or dealing with my ex or his attorneys. And so it was constantly hammering me with things that I was really scared of.
Yeah, and it's tough, right? Especially when you're in that situation, your brain wants to focus on it a lot. And the best thing we can do in those situations, again, is ask ourselves, is this helpful? And if it's not, redirecting our attention away from it. So the way I explain things to the patients I work with is like, our brains are not the brightest. They don't know better. We have to teach them what to do. So we know it's not helpful to suppress thoughts in the sense of like, I don't want to think about this. I don't want to think about this. And in the OCD world, a big example is like, if I said to you, don't think about a pink elephant, don't think about a pink elephant, right? Like most people get an image of a pink elephant. So if it's like, I don't want to worry about this, I don't want to think about this, you're suppressing it, but you're actually giving attention to it, which makes your brain think about it even more. So I teach patients to recognize, like, again, this is not helpful for me, especially if there's nothing you have control over, right? Maybe you could learn more about the court system and you can educate your lawyers and, right, where do I have control? So you can kind of say to yourself, I did everything that I could and these other things are outside of my control. So I want to redirect my attention away from that so that my brain can learn, hey, I don't like thinking about these things. These things are not helpful for me.
Mhm. Yeah, it's not progressing anything further, but we
Right.
know it's really hard. So, being in a situation like what I just described, we know goes on for years, often at least with a lot of our clients, and most of us have children. And so, one of the main things you and I were going to talk about too is like, how do I help my kids, especially when my kids are anxious, if I am completely anxious too? So
Yeah.
do you have any ideas on like what, first of all, how do I recognize anxiety in a child? Since I know you work a lot with children, what are
Yeah.
some things parents should look for?
Yeah, so I'd say some major signs are typically something like stomach aches. That's a big one, especially in kids that have difficulty maybe going with the other parent or even with, difficulty going to school. A lot of times they'll say my stomach hurts because they don't
Mhm.
have the language to be able to recognize like, I feel scared, I'm worried, I feel anxious. So that's definitely a big one. Sometimes changes in mood and kids can get very irritable when they're anxious. And I see this a lot that kids are mislabeled as defiant when in reality they're just anxious. And this happens a lot in the school system as well as at home. The kid's like, well, I don't want to do that. And it's not because they're trying to be defiant and just be like, well, I don't want to do that just because, right? There's a reason they're really anxious or they're scared about whatever it is that you're asking them to do. So I really encourage parents to, if possible, get like a full evaluation done and meet with a specialist so you can pick apart what exactly is happening. Because without understanding your child, it makes it really difficult to figure out, what's happening. Because if you, again, are assuming that your child's defiant and then you're punishing them, right, that's not helpful because you're not getting to the root of the issue and figuring out, well, this child actually needs help with their anxiety and that's what's happening. So I'd say irritability, again, is a really big thing in kids that are anxious that again gets mislabeled, especially in the school system too. So once parents can figure out what's going on specifically with the child, then they can work with the school as well to educate them on how they can best help the child as well.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting about defiance masking anxiety. I was going to ask you also, how do kids manifest anxiety differently than adults? Like, are there like is it different when you're looking at an anxious adult versus an anxious child? Like, are adults also like a defiant adult?
Yeah, I mean, adults can definitely get very irritable, right? Or snap. Let's say they easily snap at their kids, but maybe they're really anxious or they're worried that something bad is going to happen to them. So it definitely can present similarly the symptoms, but people can also present differently. And that's why it's really important to have an assessment done to understand why is this happening.
All right, so we were talking about adults, and before you had mentioned how sometimes defiant children, it can be masking anxiety, and I had asked, what about adults, and do they manifest differently or the same when it comes to
Right.
anxiety?
Yeah, so I think the symptoms can be very similar. The difference, I'd say the main difference is really that adults can often vocalize, like, I feel scared, I feel worried, I'm, anxious about whatever it is that's happening, where kids are not able to do that. But yes, the irritability, I was talking about like the stomach stuff that comes up, stomach aches, vomiting, diarrhea, all those types of things can be very similar, shaking, sweating. Um, for people, yeah, that have experienced like panic attacks, right? Those can look very similar in adults as in children. But again, it comes down to with kids, it's harder because they can't always verbalize exactly what's happening because they don't have the language or the tools to even be able to manage it. So yeah, I would say is the only difference. But yeah, it definitely can present very similarly in terms of like the physical symptoms that they experience.
Yeah, I mean, and we've talked in the past with others about emotional literacy and the importance of teaching your child language to express their feelings. So it's like a perfect example where kids can benefit from learning how to express themselves, and labeling makes it kind of go away, or at least eases it sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is like, I think during COVID, I was going into like preschools and teaching, really young children, 3 and 4 year olds, different feelings. And it's a great thing for, kids to learn at a very young age that they have that language. And sometimes, I see in kids that are 9 or 10, they have other things going on, like a language disorder. So even though they may know the feelings, they're not able to identify or really label them in certain words, and that makes it really difficult because they can't say what's going on for them. It's really hard. So that's why I'm always a really big proponent of meeting with a professional and understanding exactly what's happening, because there's so much overlap in anxiety. It can look like ADHD, there could be autism involved, OCD. There's so many things that have overlap, and it's really important that you figure out what exactly is happening so that the child can learn more about what's happening with them. And you can also figure out how to teach them what language to use and how their brain works so that they can learn tools as well to be able to manage whatever it is that they're feeling.
Yeah, yeah, I see. We just got a comment. I remember when I got my son a therapist, I told her he looks like how I feel when I'm having an anxiety attack.
Yeah. Okay. And
So,
that's helpful because for a lot of parents too, they deal with anxiety. So we know that when parents have anxiety disorders, from research, that kids are anywhere from like 2 to 7 times more likely to suffer from anxiety as well. And parents, even whether it's anxiety or ADHD or autism, they'll notice like, hey, I have very similar symptoms. Even with OCD, like a parent will say, oh my, I did those rituals when I was younger too. And that can be helpful, right, for parents to recognize like, hey, I can, because I deal with these things, I can recognize it in my kid, and then I can likely get them the help that they need and help them manage it.
yeah. So speaking of that, we talked about how our community is mostly dealing with going through very difficult situations with their exes in family court, and then having to co-parent with them afterwards. And so it doesn't go away. And the impact that it has on creating anxiety in parents, what, like, I feel like, what can we do to help our kids if we're so anxious? Like, what if I say, all right, I can't deal with myself right now, but what if I just send my kid to a therapist? Is that going to ease things? Like, just to say they can take care of it with my kid, and what about for myself? Like, as a parent, do I need to do anything?
Yeah. Absolutely. So usually if parents come in to help with me and I can see that their anxiety is impacting their kids, I'll say you absolutely need to be in therapy. You need to find a way to deal with whatever you're dealing, because kids are smart. They pick up on those things, right? And a lot of kids I've worked with have learned their anxiety from their parents because they see, well, mom gets anxious every time I'm sick. Then they start to learn, well, maybe I should be anxious when I'm sick. And that's one way that kids develop anxiety. It can be a very much learned behavior. So it's really important that parents are able to manage their own anxiety because a lot of the work that I do with parents is like, when your child's dysregulated, you need to be able to be calm. And if you can't be calm, then that's a problem, right? And every parent will say to me, yes, I lose my cool, I'm yelling, I'm, anxious, whatever it is. And I can see that that makes my kid melt down even longer because I'm not able to stay calm in that situation. So it's really important that parents are figuring out ways for themselves. How can I manage my own anxiety? Because again, it often impacts the child as well. And that's where the statistics likely come from to say, hey, if you have anxiety, your kid's 2 to 7 times more likely to have an anxiety disorder themselves. But we know that kids do better when their parents are doing better, right? It's hard as an adult if you can't manage your anxiety, right? How can you expect your kid to do it? It's the same thing when I see a parent like screaming at their child. It's like, you are a grown adult and you can't manage your own anger. How do you expect your child to do it?
Hmm.
Right? Like that's an important thing, is that you're modeling for them, right? This is something that I can handle, and it's something you guys can do together to be able to label and say, hey, I'm feeling really anxious right now. Like, let's do our breathing together. Like, let's learn strategies to do these things together. And with some parents, if they're triggered really easily, I'll say, then you guys need to do something like a time, you can call it a time in, where it's like mommy's going to her room and she's going to cool down. You go to your room, you're going to cool down, or we can do some breathing together. And then let's talk about this after. But it's really great if parents can model, hey, I'm having this feeling and look how I'm dealing with it in a healthy way, because that's important for kids to witness as well. If they only witness, I'm anxious and I scream at my kids, right? That's not healthy for them to be exposed to. So it's really, really important that parents themselves figure out, why am I anxious? What's contributing to it? And what can I do about it? Because that definitely makes a difference.
Yeah, I recently learned the term about self-regulation and how, as parents, it's so important for us to learn to self-regulate, which is basically what you're describing, like calm ourselves down so that we can co-regulate. We can help our children make sense of their own experiences as well. And is that basically what does that fit with what you're saying? Because I feel like it sounds like the perfect example. Like I have to calm myself down so I could teach my child how to process what's happening too.
Right, absolutely. Because you, as a parent, right, need to be in a state where that you can be calm and you can support your child, as opposed to the other way around. Because sometimes the kid's in a position where they're trying to calm the parent, and that's not their job, right? Their parent, I talk with all the parents to be very clear with the kids that it's not your job to take care of me, because that's something I see a lot in kids. Like, they're afraid to talk to their parents about their anxiety because they know, well, mom will worry if I tell her, so I don't tell her these things. And
Mm.
trying to protect their parent, take care of their parent. And that's not healthy, because those are the kids that grow up and they become people pleasers because they always put their parents' needs before their own. And that's obviously not healthy. So it's really important, again, that parents are in a good place, that they can take care of the child, and the child knows, hey, I can go to my parent and they can handle it. They can be there for me. And again, for the parent, it's looking at, what exactly does that you need? You need to be in some type of therapy where you can learn skills to manage your anxiety. Self-compassion is really important for parents to use, right? A lot of us grew up in households where maybe we were labeled as lazy or you're no good or whatever it is, right? And that voice carries into adulthood. So a lot of adults and parents that I've worked with really struggle with being kind to themselves and saying, hey, you know what, I did the best I could today, and that's all that I could do. But instead it's like, what's wrong with you? You're lazy, you should be better. And as you can imagine, right, that stuff's not helpful. That's not what motivates us to make change. So it's really important, again, that parents look at, how am I speaking to myself? Because you're also modeling for your kid, right? Like, how are you responding when you're anxious or when you're irritated or angry? And if it's not a good response, right, your kid's likely to repeat that as well.
Mhm.
I think parents can also look at, a lot of parents I work with take on too much. They are overwhelmed. Being a parent itself is stressful. I mean, the US general surgeons, put out a warning, I think it was back in August, that said, like, this is a problem. Parents are stressed. And I think that was really validating for a lot of parents to hear, because it is such a big issue. Being a parent is very stressful, and especially if you're dealing with kids that have any type of neurodivergence, anxiety, OCD, learning disabilities, autism, ADHD. It's very, very stressful, and it impacts the whole family. So parents really need to find an outlet for themselves. So again, if that's saying no because I'm to certain things that I'm taking on too much, relaxation techniques. Mindfulness is huge. There's a lot of support around mindfulness, especially in people that have struggled with more complex trauma, which is probably a lot of the people that you've worked with, right? From that
Mhm.
repeated exposure to being invalidated or gaslit, like that takes a toll on your nervous system, and you've got to train and teach your nervous system how to be calm again. Finding something every day that brings you some type of peace can be really helpful too. And obviously, that could be hard time to find, especially if you're a single parent. But is there something in your day, whether you're getting a coffee, taking a longer shower than usual, like really finding something that you can look forward to every day? Support groups are really great too. I know that's something that you offer with your clients, like, feeling like you're not alone, because the reality is that, everyone struggles with anxiety to some degree. So anyone that says, "Oh, I'm never anxious," I call them out and say, I don't think so, right? You may have a little bit of anxiety, maybe it's not to the point. So when we use the word disorder, in the mental health world, it really means it's impairing for you, right? It's getting in the way of your functioning, or you're not able to do whatever it is that you need to do. So even if it's not to that level, people still experience anxiety to some degree. It's a very normal feeling to have. And I think educating yourself about anxiety too, because a lot of people, going back to those myths we had talked about before, people assume that if I'm anxious, that means that something bad is going to happen, or that I can't handle what's going to happen. And that's not true, right? That's just your nervous system alerting you because it believes that there's potential danger. But like I said before, sometimes our nervous system gets it wrong, but it really is coming from a good place and it's trying to protect us. So I think for some people, just reframing it in that way, that the anxiety, in that moment, I get messages all the time from people through my blog, like, when I have a panic attack, am I going to die? Am I going to
Mm.
suffocate? And the reality is no. In those moments, anxiety is not imminently dangerous in any way. And yes, you should always check with your doctor and, make sure nothing else is going on. But if you do know, like in a panic attack, that it's anxiety, right? We know that there's no danger coming from that. Yes, long-term anxiety can definitely take a toll on you, but knowing, hey, in this moment, I'm not dying from this. My body sensed that believes something bad's going to happen. It's possible it got it wrong, and I
Mm.
can get through this. That's important. That because I feel anxious does not mean something bad's going to happen. Again, it's possible my nervous system perceived that something bad was going to happen and it didn't actually happen. So that's an important thing that people can recognize, because a lot of people I work with are like, oh, like, I'm not going to die from a panic attack. Like one session in, they're like, oh, I'm already feeling a little bit better, because they know, right, I'm not dying from this. I'm not suffocating. Like, I'm okay. Yes, it sucks. It's super uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean that anything bad is going to happen.
Right. And it'll pass.
Right. Yes, because so many people, right, when they feel panic, you'll see all over, social media and the internet is all these coping skills and try to stop the panic attack from happening. When in reality, if we can ride it out, that is the best thing that we can do. And sometimes we're in situations, and I work with teachers and they're like, I'm in front of the class, I can't just let it pass. And maybe that's a good time where you're using some type of coping skill. But in reality, the best thing you can do is to ride it out, because you can't fight your physiology.
Mm.
And if you fight it, right, you're trying to hold it in, you're teaching your brain that those feelings are dangerous, which in turn make your anxiety worse over time. So it comes back to that idea that we have to teach our brain, what's okay and what's not okay. So if I feel panic symptoms coming on and I decide, I'm just going to ride it out, I lower my shoulders, relax my jaw, just like loosen my hands, and I'm telling my brain, hey, we're good, we're just going to ride this out. My brain's starting to learn, hey, maybe these panic symptoms are not so bad and it's okay. And over time, people recognize they have less panic attacks. So it really comes down again to, how are you responding? So yes, anxiety gets it wrong sometimes and you get those false alarms, but the problem really comes in terms of how people respond to the anxiety, because what they do often makes the anxiety worse. They prolong panic attacks because they're trying to hold it in like this, I don't want it to happen, and it ends up prolonging it for a long period of time. And obviously, people don't want to have that happen, but they don't understand because they haven't learned, what's the job of the nervous system and how do I teach my brain that, hey, we're good. And that's where exposure therapy is really helpful too. If you are having panic attacks every time you drive a car, most people are going to say, well, I'm not going to drive anymore. And when they don't drive, they've taught their nervous system, hey, nervous system, you got this right, driving is not safe for me. when in reality, they need to be doing the opposite. They need to get back into the car and again, work with a therapist and do it very gradually to be able to drive again, because then the brain realizes, hey, nothing bad happened. We're okay. We don't need to alert you anymore. And you also learned that you can do it, because anxiety's job, again, is to keep you safe, and it will do anything possible. And even if that's lying to you, saying, hey, you can't handle that, you can't drive a car, you can't get through this, when in reality, you can, but you have to teach your brain and your nervous system that you can do it by putting yourself back into those situations. And I obviously always recommend that you do that with a licensed therapist to learn more about it and do it for yourself. And I know that's not reality for everyone. Um, but it's important to know that a lot of people don't realize that they're making their anxiety worse, right? I feel anxious. I don't want to feel it. So I'm going to avoid these things. And obviously, in situations you're talking about too, like you can't avoid those situations. And people end up in a very chronic state of like fight or flight, especially when you're going through year-long battles in court. And that's where things like mindfulness, going for walks in nature, things like that, you're reminding your nervous system, hey, this is what it feels like to feel calm. And that's something that people really need to engage in order to recognize or notice, hey, I can feel a little bit less anxiety.
Yeah. And as you're talking, I'm like trying to scribble notes and not
Okay.
move my face around
Yeah.
too much. But it's interesting. I'm thinking a lot about labor pains and how when you're, for all the men listening, sorry, you're never going to experience this, but with women, it's like when you go into labor, it is agony to feel those labor pains, and there's nothing you can do to make them go away, but there's things you can do to sort of breathe into it and realize like it's going to end and I'm not going to die, even though it feels like you're going to die.
Right.
But it's so similar, like you can learn techniques to get through it. And I also love how you frame this as a way of empowering yourself, that like you can teach your brain like I'm going to be okay, even though your brain is saying you can't do this, like you're not going to be able to make it. The parallels between that and what we do with our clients in terms of facing their issues with the family court system and with their counter parent and everything else. We're working on a course now. We're working on a program. It's called From Fear to Fierce in
Oh,
Family Court. But a lot of it is dealing with the fear, because people are so terrified and they never been through something like this. And they feel like, I can't do it. I can't do it. I'm just going to avoid it. You can't avoid it. So it's about, parallel to what you do, it's like teaching people how to get through the fear, how to like work your way through it, and know you can certainly get through a lot of things, a lot more than you think you can, even though it's
yeah.
extraordinarily uncomfortable and terrifying and overwhelming. And there's a sense of dread of like, I'm not going to be able to do it. Like, you can do it. It's all about like learning, like you say, like learning techniques and learning from the right support system how to do it properly, rather than just saying, I give up. My
Right.
life is over. I can't function.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where that, idea that like if I feel anxious, that means I need to avoid it or that something bad's going to happen,
Right.
rather than trying to reframe it as, well, maybe I'm anxious about because it's new, right? It's something I
Right.
haven't done before. And our brain obviously loves to know exactly what we're walking into. What does it
Mhm.
look like? And then, most people, it's pretty common when you're going somewhere new and you don't know what to expect, you're going to feel anxious about it because your nervous system is alerting you like, hey, we're walking into something new. Like it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. But the idea is
Right.
I can be anxious and I can still do it
And
anyway. And that's
it's normal. And
right.
like that anxiety is normal for this.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you've been in an abusive relationship and you're going into court against this person, like your nervous system knows that person abused you and treated you badly. Like it's when you see them, you get really anxious.
And you're
Again, you're
allowed to.
yes,
Like,
right?
that's what you're supposed to.
It makes sense. It would be weird if you didn't, right? Because your nervous system knows that person hurt you. If you're going near them, I'm going to alert you and say, hey, are you sure you want to go near them? So it's trying to send you a message. Again, it thinks it's keeping you safe in everything that you do. And I know I had talked to you before that I work a lot with more like irrational fears, like fear of the dark or fear of driving and things like that. But when you're working, and I'm not a trauma therapist, but if you're with someone, in a room with someone that hurt you, abused you, gaslit you, narcissistic abuse survivors, right? Like your nervous system's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. And it doesn't mean that you can't get through it and you can't handle it, but it's saying, hey, remember, this person did not treat you well, right? And then a lot of times we have a bad experience and then that anxiety overgeneralizes. So, right, you were in an abusive relationship, now anxiety, let's say if it was with a man, your anxiety may now tell you, well, now every man is dangerous or the world is a dangerous place. And those are very common beliefs that come from people that experience trauma. And that's where some of the exposure therapy can be helpful to say, okay, well, this person has not abused you, right? It's assuming because this man did, now every man is going to do the same to you. When in reality, that's not always true. Um, so it's interesting, but I think people can be less afraid of the anxiety they feel if they recognize, like, hey, my body's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's trying to keep me alive. It's not a bad thing. Like, anxiety gets such a bad rap because it's uncomfortable and it sucks, and everyone wants to stop it from happening. And I always tell people, like, if you go to someone and they're like, oh, I'm going to get rid of all of your anxiety, like, that's crap. That's
Yeah.
not reality. Like, you need some anxiety, right? If we didn't have anxiety, like, kids have said to me, like, what if we removed the amygdala, which is like the
Yeah.
fear center of your brain? You would walk into traffic and you wouldn't look both ways because you would think, oh, I don't have to worry about anything, right? Like, there's benefits to having those, right? You need it to keep you safe. But again, the anxiety part comes in when now we start avoiding things, right? And we're worried in situations where we don't need to be, but our nervous system doesn't know better. And that's where treatment can be really helpful in recognizing, hey, I can be anxious and I can do this thing anyway.
Yeah, you just made me think of something that I was like, oh wow. So I think I told you, Chris and I, we have this weekly legal abuse support group,
Yeah.
and we do blend our male and female clients together, which is very, very unusual because, in these domestic abuse situations, people get like terrified of the other gender, like you just talked about. And in the beginning, when we started, we had Chris off camera just for like a couple of sessions because I was like, what if there's like all these women that are afraid, and then we stop doing that, and we're like, no, it's important for them to see men are not all dangerous. And as the group has grown these past 3.5+ years, we have more men in the group, and it's been so amazing. And I guess it is some kind of exposure therapy for both men and women to be like, I'm not afraid, actually, if I can listen to that other person's perspective and see how we have a lot in common, and that we all want the same thing, because everyone in our group is protective, like healthy parents, whether they're men or women. Like it's really, really great. So you just made me feel like, oh, now I
Yes.
it's not
Good.
exposure therapy, but it is a sort of thing where I feel like that's very important. I don't think it's a good idea to just shield people and to make them be like, well, I'm afraid of men, so I'm not going to talk to them anymore. Or like, I hate women because of my ex-wife, so I don't want to talk to them. Like, it's really important to get them back talking to each other, and listening to each other, and seeing, that we're all going through this together and supporting each other. Um, so speaking of that, we got a question a little while ago that I wanted to see if you could answer. It says, what can we do as parents to help kids that have developed anxiety to prevent them from anxious attachment styles as an adult?
Yeah, that's a tough one because
Yeah.
yes, as we know, kids grow up and whatever type of attachment style they had in the home that they're in with their parents, they usually grow up and repeat those similar things. I think as a parent, we have to do our best to really validate our child's feelings. Making sure that we're a safe place that they can come to and talk to. Because again, a lot of kids I work with are afraid to go to their parents, either because their parents have a very negative reaction or very invalidating. So, like, a common thing, if your kid comes to you and expresses fear about something, and you kind of say, and it doesn't mean that it's ill intended, but to say, like, oh, that's nothing to worry about,
Yeah.
or what are you anxious about? You don't need to be, right? It's actually really invalidating.
Yeah.
And some parents, will recognize, like, wow, my parents used to say that to me. Like, I was working with a mom a couple weeks ago, and her kid was like upset at a party that he was left out, and she's like, my instinct was to go and say, like, you really shouldn't be so like upset about that. And she's like, I caught myself and realized I was invalidating him, but that's the house that I grew up in. That was just like, oh, you have nothing to be worried about. Like, why are you letting that bother you? Instead of really validating and saying, like, hey, I can see why that was so upsetting for you. I understand why you're really scared. That's what kids need, because these kids that have chronic invalidation, these are the kids that grow up and they struggle with relationships. This is more like borderline personality disorder. This is even linked to pathological narcissism. If you're looking at your partner, right? And like, how did they end up like that? They likely grew up in a household where they were invalidated a lot. And usually when I say that to parents, like, oh, this is the outcome if you keep invalidating them, they're like, oh my goodness, I don't want my kid to be a
Yeah.
narcissist. Like, I didn't even know where that came from.
Wow.
But it's, and that's why I always say to parents I work with, I'm so passionate about the work that I do with you because you have a chance to have your child have a healthy, mental health life going forward, but they need to have a safe parent. And even if you don't agree with why they're upset, it's still important that they can hear for you. I see this is really hard for you. I can
Mm,
see you're really upset about that. I'm sorry you're dealing with that. And also helping them to, a lot of the work I do again is facing your fears, doing that exposure therapy. But kids need to be validated first and say, hey, I can see this is really, really hard for you, but I also know that you can do it. And
mhm,
that's, really comes from this program. It's called the SPACE program, which stands for Supportive Parenting of Anxious Childhood Emotions. And it's a great program that came out of Yale Child Study Center. And I was very lucky to work with Dr. Leibowitz for a couple of years. He created the program. And it really helps. It's a parent, strictly parent program, but it helps parents reduce the accommodations that they're engaging in for their child so that their child indirectly can face their fears. So when we think about accommodations, it's really anything that a parent is doing or not doing in order to prevent their child from feeling anxious. So let's say my kid has social anxiety and gets invited to a party and I say, oh, let's, I'm just going to cancel that. Like, let's not go. Or,
mhm,
we're at a restaurant and I always order the food because my child's too anxious. That ends up teaching the kid, I don't think you can handle that, right? I think I'm doing a good thing protecting them from feeling anxious, but I'm actually not, right? I'm putting them in these situations where they're never getting a chance to face the fear and realize, like, hey, look, I actually did that and nothing bad happened. So we
mhm,
know that parents, again, can really impact their child's anxiety. And again, that validation piece and helping them realize, like, I believe in you and I know you can do this. And that's where it's important for parents to learn the role that they're playing in their child's anxiety. Because as parents, right, we try to shield our kids from, what people would consider more negative feelings. I don't want my child to be sad. I don't want my child to be anxious. But if they're never anxious or never sad, they can never learn how to deal with those feelings. So it's really, really important that they can go out and experience it because I've seen a ton of kids go and face their fears and the pride that's like, wow, I did that. They're so excited, they feel so good about it, and that's what they need to feel confident. But if we're sheltering them from everything and not wanting them to ever feel anxious or uncomfortable, right, that's not healthy for them. That's that avoidance piece that's just going to maintain anxiety. So it's really important again that parents are recognizing, what am I doing? And if you feel like you have a child that has more, again, irrational fears, like, not going to school, I have to always sleep with my kid at night, I have to order food for my kid, the SPACE program, again, can be a really great resource because it educates parents on how can you slowly remove these things that you're doing that are actually making your child's anxiety worse. And again, it would be very different if a parent, a child's going with an abusive parent, that wouldn't fall into really the SPACE program. So,
mhm,
I've talked with people that's like, my kid throws up every time they have to go with the not healthy parent.
mm,
And it's like your child's nervous system is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. If that child knows that that other parent is abusive to them in some way, and they may not have the language, and obviously it's important that we're not talking negatively about the other parent, right? Because we know that that doesn't end well, but we still need to be able to validate and help them, understand that what they're feeling is real and that it's okay that your nervous system again is doing exactly what it's supposed to do.
yeah. Yeah, I mean that sounds amazing. And I was thinking as you were talking about basically teaching learned helplessness when you do everything for your child, thinking, oh, they just have a hard time with that. I'll step in and take care of it. We often have to tell our clients, like, stop swooping in and being the superhero.
Right.
Like, stop it. Like, you have to let your child deal with some of these things. Obviously, I'm not talking about like
Sure.
abuse stuff, but in
Yeah.
terms of learning them, teaching them how to advocate for themselves in certain situations, and also to develop resilience. And I also, I've seen, used to be a high school English teacher, and I've seen situations where kids do feel so proud, and adults do too, when they confront things that they think, I'm never going to be able to do it, especially in the work that Chris and I do. And then they do it and they're like, I can't believe it. And wow, and this amazing thing happened. I never pictured it. And I've experienced that myself too. So this is very inspiring.
Yeah. And that it's the best gift we can give to our kids is for them to be able to feel confident and know that they can do their own things and that they'll be successful. And that's how they feel successful later in life, is knowing, hey, I was able to do these things. I can accomplish these things. And yeah, it's not healthy for parents to always swoop in on things that kids are capable of doing themselves.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for talking to me at length today.
Yes, absolutely. Glad that we could fit this in.
Yes. And can you tell people how they can find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best or easiest way probably to find me is just to go through my Instagram page. So my handle is How to Beat Anxiety blog. If you're in the states of Connecticut or New York and are looking for therapy for your child or interested in potentially doing something like the space program that I mentioned, you can feel free to just send me a direct message through there. And yeah, if there's any other questions on my page, I try to do things like Wednesday wisdom. So I always ask, is there any topics that you want covered? I also have an Amazon page. There's a link in my bio too, where I put, books, or again, for people who don't have access to treatment or can afford treatment. I have a list of all my favorite books for things like mindfulness, managing, your own anxiety as a parent, ways to help your kids. So that's a great resource too.
All right, great. Well, thank you again so
Yes.
much.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, take care.
Okay, you too.
Bye.
Bye.